Hello, friends, and welcome back to our SBT Sunday teachings. My name is Venerable Tarpa, and today we are going to be exploring the Buddha's enlightenment. Quite a topic. Our dear friend Tenzin Wanmo asked if I would speak a little bit on this. And I was just saying how thrilled I am that we're back to Sunday teachings again. We're between programs. I really like nice casual Sunday teachings on a great subject and forward all of our practice and our progress. So anyways, with that said, let's dive right into it. Today, I am going to attempt the impossible. I am going to try to share this topic on multiple levels for both the novice and the advanced. So we always have novice here, and there are our dear friends and our favorite Sangha members, but we also have advanced folks that are here that, as you can imagine, they want some more detail. They want to know a little bit more about the ins and outs. So I'm going to try to give a nice little balanced presentation for the novice. If it seems like we're using strange terminology or you don't quite get something, that's why. It's there for the advanced. Although you can, on our download library on our website, you can download the SBT glossary of Buddhist terms, and it's fairly short, but you can download that. You could print it out in a spiral bound, keep it with you for Sunday teachings, and look up terminology as you need. So, with that said, the topic we're going to talk about isn't as straightforward as you might imagine, like anything is in Buddhism, right? In Buddhism, we always, being a secular group and being open to all traditions, we always battle this idea of multiple views, that all of the different traditions and schools of Buddhism have different versions, presentations, views on these various topics. And we don't necessarily like to favor one. We like to share them all and let you, as a responsible audience member, make up your own mind. SBT, we don't like to tell people what to do. So with that said, of course, the two branches of Buddhism, Theravada and Mahayana, all have their different presentations on this subject. And what's kind of funny, Wangmo asked me for some sutras on the topic, and I've read through, I think, all the sutras at one time or another. And there's a lot of sutras. You know, they claim that there's 84,000 teachings of the Buddha. So when you talk about sutras, between the Theravada and the Mahayana, it's a big effort to try to read them all in one's lifetime. But I think somehow I've probably made it through them all. And but when it came to this subject, I could have sworn that there was a single place that just laid out the whole story of the Buddha's enlightenment. And when I went to find that for Wangmo, I found that I couldn't find it. And I'm thinking that it must have been in a commentarial text from school that I read it. So in the Mahayana, they follow a commentarial tradition, and that is that they read later accounts of masters explaining the sutras. So I think in one of our Sarah textbooks, they probably had just a nice straightforward story about it. But when you actually try to look it up in the sutras, you find that there isn't necessarily one straightforward presentation like you think there would be, especially quite possibly the most important story in all of Buddhism, right? But it's a little bit scattered throughout the sutras. And let alone is it scattered, it's also scattered by topics as well. And I'm going to get into that with you. I have a feeling that this teaching is going to turn into, at some point, a discussion of what is enlightenment. So what I thought I'd do is first give an account of the Buddha's enlightenment, explain it a little bit, then but I think most likely we'll probably get into trying to understand what enlightenment is, especially from a secular Buddhist point of view. That's something that's very important to us. What aspects are dogma, and what can we take as fact as secular Buddhists. So, of course, the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, it always starts right at the beginning of his life. They just share the whole thing, and we don't have time for that today. This is an extensive subject, so let me make it kind of short. I think it's the age 29. He renounces the Buddha renounces his privileged life as a prince in a palace, according to the stories, and embarks on the spiritual quest. He explores various ascetic practices as a yogi, pushing his body to extreme limits, and realizing that this extreme asceticism, in which he almost starves himself to death, is not the way. He instead adopts a middle way path. And so to wrap that up, so 6 years, the Buddha lives in a cave, and there's stories that he eats 6 grains of rice and 6 juniper berries a day. He lives on that. But fasting was a big part of the Jain tradition, the Jain religious tradition. And Jain is a precursor to Buddhism, Jainism, and Brahmanism. So I think it's clear that the Buddha was engaged in a lot of Jain practices. The Jain practice fasting to the point where many, many masters die of starvation within their retreats, and it's considered a very auspicious thing. So the Buddha, the brilliant one, doesn't take it that far. He reaches a point where he realizes, if you remember, the Buddha is on a quest. He's talking about that he's seeking spiritual liberation because he's looking for the answer to why we suffer. And so now the Buddha does these extremely extremely asceticism practices and starves himself. There's all kinds of stories of, they wouldn't allow sleep. Some would burn themselves with fire. But what he finds is at a certain point, he says, this isn't working. I'm just suffering more. This is not the way to end suffering. So the Buddha, he breaks his fast and he accepts a meal of rice and milk offered by a little village girl, and regains his strength. And the funny story is that his other ascetics that he's meditating with, they all get angry with him because he's given up the practice. They think he's weak. They think he's abandoned them all, and they all get angry and leave him. But what the Buddha does then, now he's in a pickle because all the teachers he's kind of surpassed. And he's gotten to the point where all of the teachings and instructions he's had clearly aren't leading to what he wants to achieve, the end of suffering. So now he doesn't know what to do. And he asks himself, what do I do? And he remembers an account when he was a boy, and he naturally fell into a type of meditation. And he remembered how serene it was and how beautiful it was. He decides to take that example and aim for it. And so this is what he does. And he goes and sits underneath the legendary Bodhi tree, which is in Bodh Gaya, India, supposedly. And he sits with the determination, I shall not stand up again until I have found the answer to my quest, till I have achieved enlightenment. So this is what begins the Buddha's awakening. Now, so he's in meditation. He's sitting on some kusha grass, which is a soft grass they use for bedding. And they say that throughout the night, it's the night of a full moon. There's they picture or they share a lot of details about what happens. I'm not sure which ones are accurate or not. Some say that the Buddha meditates for 49 days underneath the Bodhi tree. They claim that it's night of a full moon, and there's 3 watches of the night, they call them, and there are 3 milestones of attainment that the Buddha reaches in this meditation. The first watch, he gains insight into past lives. So many of our advanced practitioners are asking, what practices is the Buddha doing to reach enlightenment? This isn't always clear, but the most acceptable answer is he's doing calm abiding, of course, right? Like we all do. But then the story says from calm abiding, he goes into jhana meditation, right? The higher meditations. He goes through the 4 jhanas, but he doesn't become a Buddha. He doesn't become enlightened. It's not until he turns to insight meditation, which I believe it's safe to say the Buddha invents insight meditation. This is something his teachers didn't teach him. This is something he discovered on his own. And insight meditation, of course, again, he's contemplating the nature of the universe. He's deeper. He's putting deep thought into his meditation. So from the jhanas, he goes into insight meditation, and he gains insight into his past lives. He sees his past lives. Now, this is according to traditional Buddhism. Then comes a second watch, where he develops what's called the divine eye, and he perceives the cyclic existence of all beings, not just his own past lives, but he sees past and future lives of beings, of his friends, of people around him. Then the third watch, he attains ultimate knowledge and the direct realization and understanding of the 4 noble truths, which is that he understands the true nature of himself in reality, through which he eradicates all afflictions and achieves nirvana, becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. Now, many cases say that there's a slight difference between nirvana and enlightenment. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the idea is that he first achieves nirvana, but he doesn't become a Buddha until somewhere between those watches. He actually, I'm guessing before the third watch, he actually achieves enlightenment and becomes the Buddha. Oh, and I got some slides for you. So I'm not taking questions right now. I want to kind of make my case, and then we'll talk about it. So when the Buddha talks about reaching these enlightenment, he says this. I believe this is the first thing he says, or he contemplates to himself upon achieving awakening. Through many births, I have wandered, seeking the builder of this house of suffering. But now I have found you, O house builder. You will build no more. Your rafters have been broken. The ridgepoles are shattered. My mind has reached the unconditioned. The end of craving has been attained. And along with that, knowing this, my mind was freed from the defilements of sensuality, desire to be reborn, and ignorance. When I was freed, I knew I was freed. I understood rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done had been done. There is nothing further for this place. I'd like to go back and clarify some of the language. So in secular Buddhism, some teachers really reject rebirth. And I remember hearing one who claimed that he thought it was just added at a later date, that it was obviously an Indian cultural thing, that it wasn't really a part of Buddhism. And the fact is, anybody that's studied the sutras knows that's ridiculous, because the sutras, I mean, in every single sutra, it talks about rebirth. So now, I'm not saying rebirth is true. All I'm saying is the Buddha deeply believed in rebirth. There's no doubt about that. He's quoted directly in so many passages. He says to Ananda, this is all for me. There is no more beginning for me, like he's saying here. So that's very clear that the Buddha did believe in rebirth, but that doesn't mean we have to. It's up to you. Some people that really have an aversion to that feeling, I support them. That's perfectly fine. Let's look at this again. Through many births, I have wandered through life, wandered through rebirth, seeking the builder of this house of suffering. That means seeking the one who is creating and trapped in samsara, right? So in a sense, we are the builders of our own suffering. We are the creators of our samsara and our being trapped in the cycle of rebirth. But now I have found you, O house builder, you will build no more. And here he's saying, I understand the mechanism of my suffering. I understand the mechanism of samsara. And now that I know it, I'm not going to perpetuate it anymore. All rafters are broken and the ridgepoles are shattered. That refers to the roofing system of a house. My mind has reached the unconditioned. Unconditioned means that which is being created by the mind. That means that which isn't naturally occurring. Oh, I really blacked out on it. I had a beautiful definition for y'all, and I kind of blacked out on it. It's often a strange word. We have these things called mental formations. The idea that the mind interprets, projects, creates a lot of our reality. That's all conditioned. Oh, I remember. I wanted to kind of team it with the idea of social conditioning, right? That we're born and we're fed all this information to see the world in a certain way. This is what they mean by conditioning, right? It's not just a natural view that you're born with. It's one that's been fed to you. And they call it gaslighting nowadays, don't they? Isn't that the popular term, gaslighting? Convincing you reality is a certain way. And the end of craving has been attained. And so if you remember, Buddhism talks about desire and ignorance as the cause of samsara. When those are gone, there's no more craving, no more wanting, right? I mean, needing's still there. You still need a meal. You still need shelter. You still need friendship. But this craving it, like having a neurotic compulsion for things, right? And then he says, knowing this, my mind was freed from defilements, which are afflictions. We call them afflictions of sensuality. That's not sexuality. This is sensuality, which means the pleasantness of our senses, the taste of a delicious meal, the smell of bread being cooked, sensuality, desire to be reborn, and ignorance. Now, this is quite fascinating, right? They talk, oftentimes we're going to talk about it today. What's enlightenment? And the Buddha kept leaving teachers and seeking out new teachers because he mastered what they taught him, but somehow inherently he knew there was more to go. And then, so many people ask me, how would one know that? If you haven't been enlightened, how do you know you haven't reached enlightenment? So many practitioners will have really strong meditative experiences and believe they'd reached enlightenment. And a teacher will step in and say, no, that's not it. That's a samadhi, or that's an experience of emptiness, but that's not awakening. But somehow the Buddha did. When I was freed, I knew he was freed at that moment. So we like to talk about awakening and enlightenment as incremental, that we're all waking more and more every day, especially if we're practitioners, right? I'm so much more liberated from samsara than I used to be. But according to the Buddha, there is kind of a breaking point there is kind of a point where there's a tipping point, right? And all of a sudden, he knew it in one night. And I'm sure his awakening was gradual, right? He had all these teachers that he practiced with. He mastered, they say that he mastered all the teachings of the day. They talk about the Buddha being a brilliant, brilliant student, equaling all his masters. And so it's not like he was awakened in one night, but the final attainment, it seems like it was kind of really came upon him. When I was freed, I knew I was freed. I understood my rebirth had ended. What kind of an experience is that you could, well, I guess if you could see your own past lives and you could see the cyclic existence of all beings, past and future lives, I guess you could see that you don't have any more future lives. Oh, his journey was completed. What had to be done was done. Nothing further in for this place. Don't you think that's fascinating? What do you guys think? Any questions, comments? What do you think? Let me see where I am. Oh, let me share one more thing with you. Does anybody have their hands up? Wait a second. So we're talking about stories of the Buddha's enlightenment and how they're in different places. One of the, I think, a really fascinating part of Buddhism, they talk about that all the, in Buddhism, there's not one Buddha, there's quite a few, and different traditions attest to different lives. I think the Theravada, it's like 7 Buddhas before the Shakyamuni Buddha, which Siddhartha Gautama is the Buddha of our age, 2,000 years ago. And that's Shakyamuni Buddha. He was a practitioner of the Shakya clan. And but what's told is that all the Buddhas awaken, or all the Buddha's life stories are the same, right? I don't know how that works, but they're all the same. All the Buddhas take enlightenment in the same way, and they all gain enlightenment at the same place. Now, I don't know which one if any of that is supported by sutra, or they're just wives' tales that teachers have told me over the years. But Lama Zopa Rinpoche is from the Tibetan tradition. He's very clear that all the Buddhas have taken enlightenment at that exact same place in Bodh Gaya, under that exact tree. They call it the navel of the universe, like the center of the universe, and he claims that like hell realms in Buddhism are 300 miles below Bodh Gaya. And it's quite elaborate, some of these stories they have. So in the sutras, one of the sutras that a lot of people focus on for the Buddha's enlightenment isn't the Buddha's enlightenment at all. It's the previous Buddha's enlightenment, and that is Buddha Vipassana. And it's found in the Mahapadana Sutra. And again, they're all supposed to take basically the same kind of rebirth. But Buddha Vipassana also was a prince, left that to go as a yogi and achieves it. The only difference is, in some accounts, they rely on different practices, or let's say different types of realization to attain it. Buddha Vipassana, it's told, is enlightened through a realization of the 12 points of dependent origination. And so you'll hear many people saying that's how the Buddha took enlightenment, but that wasn't Shakyamuni Buddha. That was according to scripture. That was Vipassana Buddha. But Buddha Shakyamuni was supposedly through the Four Noble Truths that he does. That was that last little bit I wanted to add to you. What do you guys think of all that? David, you got a question? Comment? Insight?
Yeah, yes. I don't understand this very well. So the Buddha the Buddha sat down and vowed not to rise until he was enlightened. Is that correct?
I
That
shall
does,
not arise again until I have the answer to my quest,
uh,
the cause of suffering.
that doesn't sound very like the middle way to me. That sounds like a very extreme sentiment.
I guess so. I mean, you remember that not everything's a middle way. We don't follow a middle way of goodness or virtue. So maybe, that's a very virtuous goal. I think it's a testament to his determination. I'll tell you
I just,
something on a personal note. I've
yeah,
done something similar in a couple times where I was determined to not get up out of meditation until I had a certain attainment I was working for, whether it was single point of concentration. Every time I did it, I had a really strong experience.
really.
None of them
Oh,
enlightenment,
I know. That's worth a try then. Eh?
maybe the next one.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Miss Wamo, did I see your hand up? Okay.
No.
So I laid out a pretty good presentation for everybody. Let's get into more of a discussion. So we talked about what practices the Buddha relied on. So, uh, so the Buddha is awakened through insight meditation, not just simple calm abiding and the jhanas, right? It's not until he goes into insight meditation. And often people say insight meditation is a natural development of your calm abiding. It arises naturally. The mind awakens, opens and awakens into it. So, I said that. I said that. I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, so what is enlightenment? Why don't we get into it? This is a fascinating thing. When the Buddha was first asked, what is enlightenment? And of course, enlightenment can be synonymous with awakening. It's not synonymous, supposedly, with nirvana, and I'll explain that. But we'll often use the word awakening or enlightenment. Awakening seems to be the new popular term. A lot of modern scholars are saying, quite possibly, we should be moving away from the word enlightenment. It's much more closer to awakening. And so when he's first asked, what is enlightenment? The Buddha cryptically gives the answer, enlightenment is the end of suffering. That was this quest, right? But it's also an encryptic answer. He's not saying what it is, he's saying what it isn't. And the Tibetans translate it as to pass beyond sorrow. I think that's pretty, huh? So the Buddha saying the end of suffering. The Buddha saying that enlightenment, or nirvana in this case, is the absence of samsara. So enlightenment and nirvana become negations. They're not something, they're the eradication of affliction. Samsara is, some people see samsara as defined as cyclic existence, being trapped in the cycle of rebirth, that physical thing of rebirth that you go through. Other people see samsara as the mental quality of or state of mind that perpetuates that state. I believe it's the latter. I believe that samsara, especially from a secular Buddhist point of view, that samsara is an unhealthy mental state. It's an affliction, like an illness, right? Now, it's not just something that's laid upon us, because it's also something, because of evolution, that we're born into as human beings. So I guess it's more like an illness that you're born with. Some children are born with a certain kind of an illness and they have to deal with it. And maybe that certain illness, there's treatment for, and they can escape it later in their lives. That's kind of how I look at samsara. They also talk about samsara being the irreversible liberation from the three poisons. The three poisons are really the three main afflictions, and they usually say ignorance, greed, and hatred, or ignorance, neurotic attachment, neurotic aversion. But those are the three main afflictions. They also have the five poisons in other sutras that add pride, and I can't remember what the other one was. So anyways, but they're all afflictions. So enlightenment, nirvana are supposed to be irreversible liberation from afflictions, from all of our afflictions, all of our shared human limitations. Enlightenment, in another way, in a positive, enlightenment is the direct realization of the true nature of oneself and reality. We use that a lot, yeah. The Buddha talked about enlightenment being beyond language and concept, only to be experienced directly for oneself. You can't conceptualize it. So an example like that would be, they always use the example of chocolate. I can tell you everything there is about chocolate. If you've never had it before, I can tell you how it's made and its ingredients. I can tell you my reaction on the tongue and all that. You can read as many books as you want on chocolate, but that's not experiencing chocolate. Chocolate is beyond language and concept, only to be experienced directly by the tongue, right? So some things are experiential, right? And enlightenment is one. So we can talk about it. We're doing it right now, but the Buddha is saying ultimately, language is very limited. So when the Buddha simply said, when they asked him what enlightenment is, and he says it's the end of suffering, he left it there. He said, it's beyond language. But later in the Buddha's life, he finds the words. He actually, in later sutras, he talks quite a bit about it and tries to explain it a little bit further. And the other story is that when the Buddha reached enlightenment, he had compassion and wanted to share it with people, but he thought no one would be able to understand it. And he was pretty much set at not teaching it. He didn't think it was possible. And then the story goes that the Hindu gods, Brahma and Shiva, they come down, not our Shiva, different one. They come down and tell the Buddha, you must teach the Dharma, so he does. Besides that, why don't I also at the same time talk about the difference between nirvana and enlightenment? Some traditions follow this and some don't. Mahayana does. Nirvana is the first experience of enlightenment. And nirvana, in one of the differences, nirvana can be just a very natural experiential experience that you get through meditation and practice. Enlightenment, though, is a little bit different. Enlightenment is this knowledge, this awakened knowledge that's beyond just experience. In a sense, it's something that needs to be learned. The Buddha discovers it on his own, but other people, we need to be taught. And again, it's that enlightened wisdom of understanding the nature of reality. Nirvana can be the eradication of afflictions, but you might not still understand the full nature of reality in yourself, right? So you could be freed from afflictions and be liberated, but not necessarily possess this exalted wisdom of the true nature of yourself in reality. The Mahayana take it a whole nother step, and they talk about nirvana. You can only become an arhat, a very high monk. Enlightenment is you could become a Buddha yourself. And then there's stories that you can live in Buddha realms, like heaven realms with beautiful flowers. And there's grand stories of what they look like. Any questions? I have some more slides on enlightenment and nirvana. If you little birds want me to fill you up some more. You want more? Huh? You want more? I got a question. Pasang.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, but that thirst, they call it, that we have for things, obsession about things, and that we never get enough. Is that a thing that goes with enlightenment, that it ends?
Yeah, those are afflictions.
Okay.
Yeah. You mean, what do they talk about? Wanting, wanting what we don't have, not wanting what we don't want. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are all a part of afflictions, very much.
Okay.
Any of that craving, any of that desire.
Tashi has a question.
Miss Tashi?
Thank you. I think my question is, so as you're going and learning, like I've, been learning from you for quite a while now, and I have cast off some of these afflictions that I used to have, and I know I have because I'll be given a situation and it's like, okay, whatever, no big deal, you know. So would I first become, does that mean I'm liberated from like that particular affliction?
Well, let's be sure about something. Even though the language they talk about, tossing these off and being liberated, in a sense, at least in my experiences, I'm lessening these afflictions, right?
Okay.
Like anger, I don't really feel visceral anger anymore. Can't remember the last time I did, but I know that I'm capable of it. If I was in a certain situation, like my brand of coffee isn't on the shelf, I could possibly become angry and kill an employee or two. I know I'm incapable of such a thing. They get my order wrong at Pizza Hut. So, uh, so I know that I haven't eradicated them. I know that and so I am more awakened than I used to be. And of course, all that peace and happiness that comes along with that, I receive. But then when we talk about these higher levels like enlightenment or nirvana, we're talking about understanding that they're really gone. Like, I to a very incredible level. I think that that's what we're talking about there. And yeah,
How would,
we just slowly move in that direction, right?
I mean, how would you know when you got to that? Wouldn't that have to be like near death?
Well, that's why I was so, I find that quote so interesting, was how sure the Buddha was, if it's an actual Buddhist quote. It's actually from
Right.
Sutra, don't get me wrong. I'm
Right.
careful not to post fake Buddhist quotes here. That's directly from the Sutra. Um, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't have an answer for that. It
Yeah.
just seems like
Yeah.
when it's ingrained enough, maybe it is. Maybe it's like saying for me, like stealing. I think it's safe to say I am completely free of stealing things. Maybe when I was a
Yeah.
little younger, maybe not so much. Just certain things, or
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because, I guess you just don't want to want to say, okay, I'm enlightened now.
and how sure
You
can
never
we ever
say
be?
that.
Yep.
Exactly. That's what
Thank
yeah.
you, Tash.
Okay. Thank
Mama?
you.
Yeah, as I've been reading the sutras more and more, especially the Mahayana sutras, there's such an emphasis on emptiness to attain enlightenment. Like that's pretty much it. Like once you understand that, you will attain enlightenment. And I'm wondering how much you think the Buddha actually emphasized that versus was that an idea that came later?
No, it comes
Because
all the way from the Theravada. The Theravada call it selflessness,
mhm,
right? No self. And the Mahayana take it a step further. They really emphasize it. Nagarjuna, first century, and
mhm.
they turned into this huge thing of emptiness. But I often wonder if the Theravada is actually more accurate because the Mahayana take it to the point of believing nothing exists, that it's all just it's all mental projection. But the
Yeah.
Theravada seem to be more grounded. The Theravada view, I think, seems more scientific. And it just means that objects lack any inherent essential essence that makes them those things. Like
Right.
we think inside a book there's some magical ingredient that's called book. Not the name, that's different. But
Yeah.
there's some kind of magical glowing cube inside that is book and gives book its nature. And the idea is, no, there isn't any. It comes together equally through originate through all its different pieces parts. No one part more important than the others.
Nope. One part self.
Yeah, but you
Mhm.
could say that these are some of the aspects of this exalted wisdom, the difference between nirvana and samsara, nirvana and enlightenment. Nirvana doesn't necessarily need this strong conceptual or direct realization of knowledge. They often, you could kind of meditate your way to nirvana. You could experience that deep state of samadhi where all your afflictions predominantly fall away. This is a good point, that there's different levels of nirvana and
Okay.
different levels of enlightenment. There's generally I think all the traditions agree that there's 3 or 4 levels of nirvana, and they all have to do with the depth of nirvana. The first level is experiencing nirvana while in meditation and not when you're out. The
Hmm.
second one, and then they say, well, the second one is experiencing uh, nirvana in meditation and a little bit when you're not meditating. And they talk
Yeah.
about residue. You still have the residue of your afflictions and wrong views. Though you've tasted liberation from them, when you come out, and though they might still be there a little bit, like Tashi was talking about, um, there's still a little residue. And then the next level is less residue than that. And then the ultimate is nirvana without residue. Usually that's upon death, when you no longer have a body or mind. Enlightenment is the same. According to the Mahayana, you can achieve enlightenment. The Buddha was enlightened. The Buddha achieved nirvana and enlightenment underneath the Bodhi tree. This is according to Bhikkhu Bodhi, who I take as an authority. So if it's wrong, send your letters to him. And but then the Buddha doesn't achieve full enlightenment until he dies, and that's called paranirvana.
Mm.
Because as long as we possess a body and mind, we suffer. So you can't be truly liberated until you die and you're not reborn again. How
Right.
you exist in that state is a big question.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Isn't that fascinating? David, you got some more for me?
Yeah, yeah. Just a quickie. Um, it, does the distinction between enlightenment and nirvana exist in the Theravada? And if so, is there a word for it in the Pali Canon?
It does. And to be honest, the first time I saw the distinction was in Bhikkhu Bodhi's work. The Mahayana have always made that distinction, but in the Theravada, I never saw it before. And I think you know that I'm not a Pali scholar. I'm not a sutra scholar. I trained in the Tibetan Mahayana tradition. I'm afraid I don't have all the Pali words for all the Pali things. So but you can AI it.
I will, I will do.
That's what I do anyways. Well, give me a second to get back to you on that. And as an old man and my memory's gone, I can't remember. So I like to speak in English. I like to get the point across. The details aren't so neat.
Okay, Tarpa, thank you.
But for some of these topics, some of these concepts in Pali, it's extraordinary the detail of terminology. Something like samadhi, samadhi they list. And so, boy, I really appreciate the Pali scholars who mastered it. It's intense detail. I'm more a hands-on guy, right? Okay, I wanted to keep going. I wanted to show you some slides I have because at this point, I think the question has really become, okay, we got the story, but what the heck are you talking about? What is enlightenment? What is nirvana, right? So these are quotes of the Buddha from the sutras, and they're quite beautiful. I'm going to make them all available after class, so don't feel you have to understand them all right now. Nirvana, the peaceful, beyond reasoning, everlasting, the not born, the unproduced, the sorrowless state that is void of stain, the essence of states linked to suffering. I'm sorry, the cessation of states linked to suffering, the stilling of the conditioned, which is bliss. I'm having some eye problem today. I apologize for my reading. An interesting thing is the word cessation. I've been doing a bit of study these days on the idea of cessation. It's a much deeper concept and term than people are aware. It's the third noble truth, and they talk about cessation of suffering. But cessation is actually an attainment as well. It's a meditative experience, a deep state of samadhi. And some of you who like Mahayana sutras and you follow the Heart Sutra, when they talk about, they describe this state: no eye, no nose, no mouth, no mind, no becoming, no not. They're actually describing cessation, and cessation, from what I've read, is actually the experience of enlightenment itself, where all the senses are arrested, and you remain. Clearly, there's some kind of awareness because you know you're having the experience, but all the faculties that we experience life with, including our mental ones, they all cease, and it's supposed to be this unbelievable state of bliss. That's why they call it here unconditioned, right? Unconditioned means that it doesn't arise from anything, right? It's the taking away of everything, and you're left in this incredible state. That's worth Googling and having some fun with it. Let's try another one. I reached and experienced the nirvana, which is unborn, unreveled, secure from attachment, undecaying, and unstained. The condition is indeed reached by me, deep, difficult to see, difficult to understand, tranquil, excellent, beyond the reach of mere logic, subtle, and to be realized only by the wise. So maybe some of the things we talked about kind of start to make sense when you read this. Nirvana is permanent, stable, imperishable, immovable, ageless, deathless, unborn, and unbecoming. It is power, bliss, and happiness, the secure refuge, the shelter, and the place of unassailable safety. It is the real truth and the supreme reality. It is the good, the supreme goal, and the one and only consummation of our life, the eternal, hidden, and incomprehensible peace. I would say that sounds more of a description of enlightenment. But, I'm not going to argue with the Buddha. This is about one of my very favorite authors, Kensor Jempa Tegchok. And he says, when attaining full enlightenment, our conventional world does not dissolve. When we have attained full enlightenment, our perception is not only the perception of emptiness, but the perception of the conventional world as well. Understanding emptiness should not destroy or distance ourselves from our conventional empirical world. It should, in fact, give us more respect for it. The Zen have a great saying where they say, in the beginning we chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, we chop wood and carry water. Some people think that enlightenment or emptiness, somehow you disappear into some magical state, the whole world changes, and you're no longer like you used to be. And Buddhism rejects that. And the reason being is because this. Now, this is another one by Teg Chok, and I love this. Nirvana is a healthy psychological disposition of the liberated state. The attainment of nirvana represents psychological freedom and moral perfection. I would change the wording a little bit for myself. Nirvana is a healthy and wholesome state of mind. Its attainment represents psychological freedom. I like that. But I think I would say more like excellence of virtue, moral perfection, two words I really wouldn't like. But this, I think, is much more of a secular Buddhist view, or a definition secular Buddhists could relate to, right? It's much more about our psychological state, our state of mind, quality of our awareness and our consciousness, our mind, than it is related to rebirth. I think that's what I wanted to say. Anyways, any of those you want me to cover again? Do you guys like those? I'll make them available to you. They're extraordinary, aren't they? But it often brings up more questions than answers, doesn't it? So because it's a negation, awakening and enlightenment aren't something. It's the eradication of samsara. A lot like saying, like wellness. Wellness isn't a thing you catch, isn't a thing, right? Wellness is the absence of sickness, right? But it's still kind of, like something you could achieve. You can say, yeah, I'm well. I've been eating my vitamins. But nevertheless, that's how we kind of look at these qualities, samsara. So when the Buddha talks about it being permanent, we're used to thinking, oh, Buddhism says nothing's permanent. They don't tell you there are a couple things that Buddhism believes are permanent. Nirvana and enlightenment are one. Because, again, it's a natural state that's unconditioned, meaning nothing needs to be created to produce it. We just have to be able to get rid of our afflictions to experience it. It doesn't mean that we possess it. It means we have the potential for it. I don't know if maybe that whole thing made everything worse. Dana, please share with us.
I've heard you in teaching before about when you were having some problems with your teeth, and that
Every day.
yeah, and so I've been having some thoughts about getting in the car, and that my pain is different, and that and I've thought about, is that the sensation of samsara, when I recognize that pain's not there, or it's different
I
than
understand.
yeah.
So here's the answer. As long as you possess, so traditional Buddhism would say, as long as you possess a mind and body, two things. One of them is you're in samsara. You can't be in samsara without a mind and body. You can fully enlighten with a mind and body. So as long as you have it, you're going to experience samsara. But some pains I wouldn't call them afflicted pains. When you stub your toe, I would just call that pain. We talk about those two arrows. That second arrow, where we start to ponder that pain and worry about it and make it worse, contemplate it, that's very afflicted pain. Emotional pain is afflicted. So I think some samsara is some pain is a lot more samsaric than others.
So
But a
my question
traditional
is,
Buddhist would say, I think they would say yes.
but my question is that when you recognize that you no longer have the anger that you had, or whatever what the affliction was, is that nirvana?
No, nirvana is a much more
Well, that's a
substan-
cessation, right?
it's but But it's much more of a substantial thing, especially because they talk about these as being states that are, what's the language they use? Um,
You don't revert back to,
Unreversible.
yeah,
But
yeah.
there's one thing about having less anger reaction, and almost to the point where you almost never experience it. According to Buddhism, that's still not the same as when you hit nirvana, and it's just crystal clear to you that you're not going to experience that again. So I think it's just levels of experience. That's my thought, Dana. Miss Wamo, hope that
It's
was
so
helpful.
it's so interesting that Dana just brought that up because I was thinking on almost the same similar lines, probably because we've both been through something similar lately. But I was thinking that for a while, that was my question, was that through enlightenment, could I gain freedom from physical pain? And what I've been learning from my studies is that the separating ourselves from our attachment to even our bodies or that pain is where you get that freedom. It's just
Very
it's
much
the,
so.
yeah.
And
And
of
so
course, that
it's
separation is separation from the two arrows, right? You
mhm.
experience that first one, but you don't compound it by putting all this mental energy on top of it as well, exaggerating it. But here's maybe a story that will answer both your questions. We look at the Buddha's life. The Buddha achieves enlightenment, but as the Buddha gets old, he still suffers. They talked about when he was getting very old, he complained about his body looking like a beat up cart falling apart, held together by straps. When he was dying, clearly he suffered terrible. He had terrible. He died from eating bad pork, so he would have been really suffering. So even though he was enlightened, he still possessed a mind and body. He
Mhm.
still was susceptible because he was still in samsara. It wasn't until the Buddha dies that he's not reborn again. He doesn't take on a mind and body, and then he is liberated according to sutras from all suffering of any kind. But isn't
So
it funny? In his enlightenment, he understands that that's what's going to happen. It's quite
right.
fascinating.
So owning a body is just having a mind and body is samsara itself.
According to traditional Buddhism, because samsara is defined as the cycle of rebirth.
Hmm.
Owning a body, owning a mind is suffering, even if you're the king of the world. Dana?
Well, so did the Buddha, as long as he had the body, he never experienced nirvana, or are we
No, he did.
experiencing nirvana and samsara at the same time?
Well, the way they make it sound is that since nirvana is irreversible, you're liberated from samsara, but to a degree. So I think that that's what we're it's all hinging on. There's degrees of being freed from samsara. That's the four types of nirvana and the two types of enlightenment, right? So you could be freed from samsara, but again still have a residue of those afflictions of that mental state. So you're freed from it, but you still got a little bit hanging on. And so there's four stages of that in nirvana, and then two in enlightenment. You become enlightened, but then full enlightenment isn't until you pass away and you're not reborn again. And that's tradition. That's a traditional presentation. That's both in the Mahayana and the Theravada. Is that helpful? Oh, Pasang, please share with us.
Yeah, I'm curious about one thing. Do we know how old the Buddha was when he died?
80 years old, according to scriptures.
Okay, thank you.
Ah, straightforward answer for a change. David.
Yeah, I think I might have asked you this question before, Tarpa, but I can't remember the answer, so bear with me. Um, the what about the situation that meditators can apparently feel no pain? I think about the monks in Vietnam who burnt themselves to death, sitting there calmly and until their body was burnt away. I mean, surely they didn't feel pain or had conquered pain or however you want
Yeah,
to.
that's right. Again, it comes down to just levels and depths of practice. Nirvana, enlightenment, there's just different levels of them. And yes, you know, as we practice, even beginner meditators can talk about that a reoccurring pain that they have is lessened almost right away for some. So the idea is it's just depth. And those monks that burn themselves, again, they must have been really great, amazing practitioners, right? And maybe they did reach some kind of level. If I could change the subject now, we're running late. I think it's an interesting topic. If anybody needs to go, just pop up. But we are left with one important question. As secular Buddhists, what do we do with all this information? What does this mean to a secular Buddhist? Because a lot of it sounds pretty religious. A lot of them are big, tall stories, Mara tempting the Buddha and the Buddha having this battle. And of course, Mara is his own afflictions. He battles his own afflictions and desires, and there's all these stories. The detail can be incredible. When you go to Bodh Gaya, there's stories what happens after the Buddha achieves enlightenment. He stays there in Bodh Gaya. Remember, Bodh Gaya is not a city at that point. This is in the forest, and there's nobody around. It's just him. He found this heavenly little place in the forest to practice all by himself. And so he stays there. And again, they talk about 7 weeks or something. That 49 keeps coming into Buddhism over and over again. 49 is the amount of days that you spend in between rebirths in the bardos. And but he stands in different places in Bodh Gaya. One spot he stands for a week appreciating the tree that gave him shelter. And when you go to Bodh Gaya, there's a spot mapped out for each one of the things. It's just hard to believe they have this kind of detail. When you think about, no one knew where Bodh Gaya was until King Ashoka found a temple that was kind of buried and being used by locals for stuff. And he decided or realized that it was the famous temple where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And then he built the great temple, the great stupa. He built the wall around it and everything else. But, there's, for a secular Buddhist, when I was in Tibet, every village claimed that that's where Padmasambhava died, the great Tibetan Buddha. And every village had an imprint in a rock that they claimed Padmasambhava melted into the rock with his hand. Supposedly it was a handprint, but it always just looked like a blob, just like a hole. But every village had it, and every village took me to see it. So, myself being around all the stories, I take everything with a grain of salt, grain of sand, grain of sugar, a grain of salt. And so, how much, is that really where the Buddha achieved enlightenment? Tashi?
I'll be quick. And you can even answer this another time if you want. But how does this story, does that fit in with all the comparative religion that seems to have the same story?
In Indian religions, the story of riches to rags is very, very common. It's funny, in the West, we do rags to riches. We love the story of the people that work. But in India, it's the opposite. They love the story of a person who has it all, and out of great generosity and wisdom, they give it away to the world, and they become amazing spiritual beings. Beautiful story. Nagarjuna, his story is basically the same as the Buddha, along with a lot of the Nalanda. They're all princes that give up everything. So again, yeah, we fall into a lot of stories. I think as secular Buddhists, we want to concentrate more on practice, right?
Yeah,
Stories
yeah.
are good. Maybe we're kind of agnostic. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not. Does it help our practice? That's another thing. But when, for me, looking at samsara as an afflicted mental state and nirvana or enlightenment as freedom from those states, that seems workable for me.
That
And
sounds
I've experienced it. I am less afflicted than I used to be. In fact, every month I feel like I'm a little less afflicted. Lately, I feel like I'm doing really good. I'm feeling really less afflicted. So, no, something's happening. I'm moving in that direction. So, I also believe it's evolutionary. I believe that early man, there's kind of two points of view. Some people would think early humankind, sorry, ladies. Some people think that humankind in the beginning were at one with nature and didn't have smartphones or clocks, and it was heaven, right? It was peaceful. I'm of the other camp. I think that they were terrified and life was incredible suffering. They didn't know what was happening with weather and solar eclipses and illness. Why is this happening to my mother? What's happening? Why is this? What happens when she dies? I think that the ignorance that they experienced would have been tragic suffering. And I think we're evolving to be more awakened naturally. Humankind is more awakened than it used to be. We have a little bit of a grasp of our surroundings, right? We know our place in the universe. And it
yeah.
seems like human beings generally, we feel more secure and happy when we have an idea that we have some control or understanding of the environment around us. So I think humankind is naturally becoming happier and awakened just with knowledge, right? And of course, that's what Buddhism is. Buddhism is a path that, it's a path of knowledge. Now, not just book knowledge, but experiential knowledge as well on the cushion. But it is knowledge, there's no doubt about that. We sit in silence on a cushion. Why? To learn about ourselves. We're not sitting there hoping some magical state will come over us and somebody will bless me with enlightenment. That's not Buddhism. Buddhism is sit still, quiet the mind, and look into the mind. Learn about yourself, awaken yourself. It's all a quest of knowledge. Something Stephen Batchelor often says, Buddhism isn't awakening isn't the accumulation of a kind of a knowledge. According to Buddhism, yes, it is. In fact, you heard it in the quotes directly from the sutras I read today. The Buddha says nirvana and enlightenment are only achieved by the wise, right? He talked about it is this knowledge that we experience. But it could be knowledge could also be realization, a deep understanding to personal experience. It doesn't
Right.
have to be like scholarly.
I love your answer.
I do too.
Great. That was real.
I thought it was excellent.
I was thinking I'd have to ask for another teaching, but
I'm going to
that
have to
was,
come here more often. I'm
yeah,
compelled.
I think so. I think so.
This
Thank
group's
you
okay.
so much. Thank you.
And so that's the idea. And then, again, with us in SBT, I like to kind of simplify it all because all of that is a lot to take in. And also put some patience in, have an idea of where we're going. But what the most important thing is looking down at our feet and making sure we're not stumbling. When you're headed in the right direction, according to the Buddha, all you have to do is keep walking. Occasionally, we have to look up and make sure we're going in the right direction. There's a point on the horizon that I'm walking towards. That it has many names. It has goodness, it is virtue, it is discipline. I'm walking towards it. It's the name happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment, joy. It has many names, but that's the one point that I'm walking towards. Join me.
I love you, Tarpa.
Love you too. So, any other questions? Pretty enthralling teaching. Yeah, I thought it was kind of cool. Any other questions pop up? Share them on the chat groups.
Thank you so much,
And
Tarpa, for tackling this subject for me. I
you're
appreciate it so
welcome.
much.
I wanted to share something else that all the slides I showed, I'm going to post them on social media. I'm also going to post links to all the sutras that I talked about here for those of you that want to bury yourself in the sutra and say, and also to prove that I know what I'm talking about. Okay. Hey, great seeing
Alpha,
everybody.
that was great. That was most surprisingly, that was a great fun session,
Ah,
which I was not anticipating at all.
oh, life's short. We got to have fun.
I agree. Great teaching.
Let's end today's class with our altruistic affirmation. May all be healthy, may all be prosperous, may all be well, may all be present, free of past regret and future worry. May all abide in constant appreciation, which is the source of great joy and contentment. May all realize their true nature and the true nature of reality, which is awakening. Bye bye, friends.